Okay, class. In this video, we're going to go over chapter 14 in the book. I had to do this video over the first time I did it. The video got messed up and wouldn't load onto YouTube properly. So I'm going to do this video again. So in chapter 14, we're going to learn how to install software and update the system. So there's two pieces of main software. The first one is RPM, which stands for Red Hat Package Manager, and that's actually the piece of software that does the installation. We can also use it to query software, what software we have installed, query different software packages, things like that. And then the other piece of software that we use is called Yum, which is really no longer Yum. It's really running DNF, but we're so used to Yum because that's what we used for years. They kept the command, but really in the back end, it's running DNF. Yum is an acronym that stands for Yellow Dog Unmodified. Back in their day, there used to be a Linux distribution called Yellow Dog, and that in that distribution, someone invented a piece of software called Yellow Dog Unmodified, which we pronounce Yum, which is a package retrieval system. It'll connect to the internet and download software from a repository, and then once it's downloaded it will pass it off to Red Hat to do the actual installation. So Yum is used to retrieve the packages from a repository, and RPM is used to install the software. Back in the day, we would just use RPM to install software that we downloaded manually off the internet. So we're going to cover RPM first. So RPM-Q, and if you specify a file like etc, ssh, sshd, config, this was our config file for our SSH server. So when you do QF, Q for query, F for file, it'll tell you what software package that file came from. In this case, it came from the Open SSH server. And if you just do RPM-Q and the name of a package, Open SSH, ACIT is kind of flaking out a little bit. If I type the name of the package, it will show me information about that package, the package name. And this name is a certain format. The first part is the package name. The second part, right there, including the 7, is the version number. And this is the release for like the distribution, 4.Enterprise Linux 8. And the last one is the architecture. This is for a 64-bit machine, but they could have compiled this software for an x86-bit machine or an ARM processor. What we're using is a 64-bit machine. So when they compile the package, they'll compile it for a bunch of different architectures and a bunch of different systems. They might compile this same piece of software for an x86 machine on Red Hat 7 versus Red Hat 8 that we're using now. So we can also get more detailed information about a package by doing RPM query information, and then you type the package name. This works because we already have this package installed. So maybe it'll query a package because it's already installed on this box. So there's the version number, there's the release, there's the architecture, there's the date it was installed on this box, there's the license that was used. In this one, it used a free BSD license. This is the name it was actually built, and the data was actually built, and this is the machine that it was actually built on. So basically, Red Hat doesn't write the Open SSH server software. Uh, that's another group of people. What Red Hat does is they've downloaded this software, the source code, compiled it for a 64-bit machine, and then took that and inserted it into an RPM package that we've installed off the uh, network. In this case, we installed it off the DVD. If you want to see what files are inside an RPM package, you can do Q list and then type the package name. And there's all the files that are in this package. You can query and find out what configuration files are in this package by doing QC. Guys, and I'm doing it all in -QC, but I could have done it like this, and it would work as the same. So open SSH server, and there's all the configuration files. Or I could have done it this way and get the same results. I prefer this method because it's less typing. If you wanted to see what documentation came in this package, every time you install a piece of software, not only does it install the software, it installs the documentation for that software. So what we're going to do is look at the documentation files that came with this package. And there's all the man files. We talked about man files, I think it was in chapter 2. If you wanted to see the scripts that were used to install the package, now I'm typing the abbreviated switch name, but some switches you can't abbreviate. Instead of doing -- query, we can just type -Q, or -- back there where we did it would be -- but we just type -I, and it's the same thing. In this particular case, there is no abbreviated switch name, so we have to type it out. And there's the switch used to install this piece of software. We could see the change log, which is all the changes this version of the software has. Every time they release a new version of the software, they create something called a changelog file that just tells you what they've updated in the software. And again, there is no abbreviated switch name, so we have to type it out. Okay, and that's a changelog. Now, we were able to run all those commands because we had this package installed. But what if you don't have the package installed? All you have is the package itself. So, guys, for this setup on Ace IT, we don't have a subscription server to the Red Hat update server. So we can't really install updates from the Red Hat site. So what I did was I integrated the CD-ROM into the image that we're using right now. And so when we query everything, we're querying the CD-ROM. We're using, and I created something like a local repository of software, which is just all the software that came off the DVD. I just want you to think of it as a repository on the internet, but it's really not on the internet, it's local. So that is in the CD folder. So I'm going to RPM query a package. So basically, if you didn't have a package installed and you wanted to query information about a package, you can point to the actual package file by using the P switch. So that software is under CD-ROM, base OS, packages, and I'm going to do open SSH server. So this is the actual installation package. This is what was really on the DVD when we installed the operating system. But again, it could point to a repository on the internet. I'm just using a local repository. So here's the package, all the information that we saw before. But you can get this information even if you don't have it installed by pointing to the actual package. I'm going to look in that directory for something we can install. CD-ROM. So I'm going to just list all the packages in that directory. So I can show you how to install something using RPM. So these are all the packages. Okay, this is what I'll install. I'm going to show you how to install Samba client. A Samba client is really the software used to connect to network shares in a Windows network. It's really called SMB, which stands for Small Message Block, but we don't really say SMB, we say Samba. It was invented by IBM, and they still support it for both Windows and Linux boxes. Windows created a backward compatible version called CIFS, but it's really just Samba. And this will allow us to connect to Windows network shares. So we'll just use this as an example to install. So I'm going to do RPM-I for install, V for verbose, give us back feedback about what's happening during the installation. And I'm going to put an H for hash marks. As you install something, it's going to have little hash marks going across the screen so you know the status of the installation. That's not really needed, but I like to put it in there just so you can see that it's progressing. So I'm going to install Samba client 4.9.1. And you see the little hash marks that gave you the percentage of what was installed. It went by so quickly that you might not have noticed it. Guys, right here, when I type this, what I did was I hit tab twice right at that point. And when I did, it showed me all the files that started with Samba-client-. And so it showed me 3 files so I could see which one I wanted to run. So then I typed 4, then hit the tab key again, and it completed it. Because this was the only thing that started with Samba-client-4. So when I hit that 4 tab again, it auto-completed it to that. And I hit enter and it actually installed the software. So I can do RPM-QI and Samba client because it's already installed. I don't have to point to the actual package. And there it's installed. If I wanted to erase a package, RPM, I can do erase Samba client. And it removed it. Okay, so we don't really use RPM a lot of times anymore. What we use is Yum. Yum points to a repository on the internet, it downloads the software, automatically passes it to RPM and installs it. You don't really want to install packages manually using RPM anymore because we have something called PCI compliance, payment card industry compliance, meaning if that machine is out of date or has software that has a known vulnerability, you either have to take that service down or fix it within 24 hours. Because when you accept credit cards in your business, you have to prove your network is secure. And you're going to hire a third-party company to audit your network and make sure that you're secure. If they discover that you're not secure, you either fix it or you take the system down. Sorry, my cat's attacking me right now. So if you manually install software, not only will you have to install that software, you'll have to install any dependents that software needs. And if you're doing everything manually, it's going to be too hard to update the system. Because what happens is when you download the software that you want, you then have to go search for all the dependents. So whoever wrote this Samba software, they're going to assume other software is going to be on the system. If it's not, then you won't be able to install that package. So you'll attempt to install it. It'll give you an error saying you're missing the prerequisites. You have to go find those prerequisites, install those if you're lucky. If you're not, when you install those prerequisites, it might tell you that you need other prerequisites. And you might have to search around the internet for all these prerequisites just to get the software that you need installed. It's a big time suck. It's a lot easier using Yum and Repository because when you install a package, it will automatically find the dependencies right in the same repository and install those at the same time. So it really cuts down your workload. When a new vulnerability is discovered, most likely the repo will have updated themselves within a couple of days, and you'll be able to install that software just using a Yum command. So now we're going to look at Yum itself. So I'm going to do Yum. I'm going to list, just show you how to list everything on a repository. Now it's going to point to a local repository for me. Some organization might have a local repository. Some organizations might have a repository on the internet, which is more common than a local. Some companies might have their system set up to have a local repository and a network repository. So when you run this command, it's going to search all of the available repositories. So what I want to do is search for any package that starts with any package that starts with HTTP asterisk. Asterisk is a wildcard. So anything that starts with HTTP in all my repositories, show it to me. And I typed it wrong. I had a single quote, then a double quote. I need 2 single quotes. It's giving me a warning saying that I don't have a Red Hat subscription. That's fine. So it's just connecting only to the local repository. If I had a Red Hat subscription, it would, because I have a local repository, it would show me all the stuff on Red Hat's repository on the internet plus my local repository. So right now, here's all of the packages that start with HTTP. The main one that I want to show you is this one right here, which is the web server. It's a HTTP daemon. That's our web server. It's Apache Web Server. So I could do a search all, and I can search for a web server. Instead of listing all the packages that start with HTTP, maybe you don't know what the package starts with. So if you just want to search all the repositories for some some repository, this will show me all the packages starting with HTTP. And they're just RPM packages, whether the local or on the internet. So I want to search all the information for the packages and find some package that mention web server. And it shows me all the items that have the term web server, and one of them is Apache. That's the Apache Web Server. Guys, this Apache Web Server is what made the internet what it is today. It's a free web server, so ISPs could install without any cost to themselves. And it was also the first web server to allow you to host multiple websites from one physical server. Prior to this software, if you wanted a website, you had one server dedicated to that website. Apache introduced virtual websites, which allowed you to host multiple websites on one web server. And Apache is a play on words. Apache is open source, meaning that they had the source code on the internet and people could introduce patches and get them integrated into the software. So they called it Apache Web Server. That's where they get the name Apache. They threw a feather on as the logo, and it became the Apache Indian, when in reality it was Apache Web Server. So that's how you can query and find a package that you need. So let's say now that you have a package, but you wanted to find out info. And this would be the same info that you would get from RPM. I'm going to pause the video for 1 second. Okay, so now if you know what package you want, you can do yum info httpd and get the same information about a particular package. If you wanted to find out what package a particular file came in, like yum provides with an S at the end, plural, etc, ssh, open, ssh, nope, sshd. So here's our config file for our SSH server. So if I hit enter, that config file came from this particular package from the internet or from the installation DVD. If we want to install something, we can do yum install httpd, and it'll install that software. In this particular case, it's going to get it from a local repository, pass it to Red Hat, and do the installation. Here's the command that I ran. Not only did it install the software that I wanted, but this software required some dependencies. And those dependencies had other dependencies. So basically, not only does it install the software, it finds out all the software that you need, that you don't have installed, and all the software that those packages need that aren't installed. And it'll actually install it all at one time. It's going to install these first, these second, and lastly, the software that we wanted to install. You see how it asks us for yes and no? And because this is the first time I'm using yum, it's asking me to install the key that was used to sign the packages. When you download software off the internet, you want to download it from a trusted source. And you want to make sure that the software hasn't been altered since they've put it up. So we want to download from Red Hat repository, and we want to make sure that since Red Hat has offered the software, or since Red Hat has added the software to the repository, we want to make sure it hasn't been altered. So Red Hat will have a public and private key. They'll create the software package, the Red Hat package, and then they'll sign it with their private key. So what we're doing right now is we're downloading their public key. So they're going to encrypt it with their private key. If we can decrypt it with their public key, we know the software came from them because only they have their private key. So it's non-repudiation. It's really not a security thing other than it's not going to be anyone can view this package. We're just going to verify that it came from Red Hat. So I'm going to click yes. That's the first key, and it wants us to install a second key. These are the public keys. I'm going to pause the video while it's installing. Okay, it's installed. We could remove the software by typing yum remove httpd. Now, instead of having to type yes every time that you install a piece of software or remove a piece of software, you can do -y and it won't prompt you to hit yes or no. In this case, you won't be. It'll go ahead and you're agreeing to installing or removing the software. So instead of having to say yes, it just does it automatically. Now we can also update the entire system by just doing yum update. In this case, there won't be any updates because we're pointing to a repository that we use to install it. So it's really the same packages. I want to point something out. When we do an update and it updates your kernel, it doesn't really update your kernel. What it does is it installs the new kernel. Because a lot of software has been compiled against the kernel that we need, that we're currently using. If I type uname -r A, I believe it is. I can't remember. Yeah, it is RA. It will tell you what kernel you're using. This is the version of the kernel that we're using. So when we get a new kernel, a lot of software has been compiled against the new kernel. So if you get a new kernel, it has to update a bunch of other software that uses that new kernel. What happens when you get a new kernel? It doesn't update the old kernel. Like if I update the Apache Web Server, it removes the old version and installs a new version. That's not the case with a kernel. When you get a new kernel, it leaves the old kernel in place and it installs a new kernel. So if something goes wrong with the new kernel, you can always go back to the old kernel. If you remember during the boot process, at the very beginning, it asks you which kernel you want to boot to. It's going to keep your last 3 kernels. So if you have an issue, you can always go back to the old kernel so you can get your system booted and fix it. There's also a recovery kernel that allows you to get in there to do some other stuff about, reset your password, things like that. So I'm going to a password recovery, I should say. So I'm just going to show you the kernel. And there's the kernel that we have installed. We currently only have one kernel. And it was installed through the Anaconda group. And I'll go into that in a little bit. Okay, well, I'll do it now. That's our next topic. I'm going to do yum group list. So a lot of times when you install a piece of software, you're going to have a bunch of related software that that user might want to use at the same time. Like we have this development tools group, and basically it's the most common development tools that users would want to install. So it might have a C compiler, it might have a C++ compiler, It might have the make tool. It might have something for Python, something for Perl, something for HTTP, something for JavaScript. So it's going to install all tools that a developer might need. So we don't have to manually install them. So they kind of group them together in a group. So we can do yum um, group install, and I could say development. No, I'm not. There's my list again. Sorry, guys. I can do yum group install. Because there's a space in this name, I have to enclose it in quotes. Development tools. This will also install all the kernels should you have to compile a piece of software against the kernel. So I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to install all this software. It's prompted me yes. There's Bison compiler, autoconfig, automake. Just a whole bunch of software that developers normally use. So I'm going to click yes to install, and this is going to take a while, so I'm going to pause the video. Okay, all the software is installed. It was actually 80 packages that it installed. So if you had to manually install this, you'd have to install each one of these things independently. There's make. Make is a utility allowing you to script a piece of software to be compiled. GCC is the G compiler. I think there's a G++ here as well. Yeah, there's a G++ compiler there. The kernel headers, if you wanted to install something that you need to compile against the kernel. G++ and the C++ are very common. This was the compiler for C++ programs made by the GNU group. And this is the C compiler made by the GNU group. They always put G in front of their software. There's a Python interpreter, a Perl interpreter. So it has a lot of software in there. So if we want to look at the log files, I can do cat var log. Remember I said yum is really just a really used to be a separate program, but now they've moved on to DNF. But everyone was so used to running yum, they just kind of changed the command. So we're going to look at the DNF log files, and there's all the software that was just installed. If I do yum alone, it just shows me all the switches. If I do, and look, the last switch is the sec severity. If I do DNF alone, it's the same program. So you could replace, instead of doing yum all the time, you can just do DNF install on a piece of software. But people have been using yum for years, so they're used to it. Excuse me. So the next thing we're going to do is look at history. So here's the history of all my yum commands that I ran, and it also allows me to undo something. So if I wanted to undo this, which did a remove, I can actually reinstall the web server. So I'm going to do yum history. It's so laggy. And undo 3. So whatever I did with 3, it'll do the opposite. So here I removed the web server. Here I installed it. If I did undo 2, it would remove it. If I do undo, but it's already removed. If I do undo 3, it'll reinstall it. So in that case, it just reinstalled that software. The next topic the book goes over is third-party repositories. The third-party repository that I'm going to show you is EPEL, Extra Packages Enterprise Linux. Basically, the Red Hat community has another project called the Fedora. And if you do getfedora.org, it'll take you to that project. And it's basically another a workstation and a client server, excuse me, a workstation OS and a server OS that has all the bleeding edge software on it. It also has a lot more packages than what Red Hat would put in their um, enterprise version of Linux. Now, when you install Fedora server, let's say, it's probably not going to be as stable as Red Hat because it's using the bleeding edge stuff, where Red Hat software is going to have the most stable software. So the Red Hat version of the software is going to be way behind the Fedora version of the software. With that being said, some people want to install packages that's not available in the Red Hat repository. So what you can do is you can install a third-party repository. Uh, uh, Fusion, RPM. There's a few of them out there, but you only want to install software from a trusted source. And right now, I trust the Fedora um, repository. It's really part of Red Hat. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to do yum RPM yum repo list all. That's going to show all the repos that I currently have. There's also a Red Hat repo, but again, I don't have a subscription, so it's not being listed here. So right now, the only repo that we have available to us is that local repo that I set up just for this image. Now the book has you install this EPEL, but they give you a different command and they point to an old version of the repository. It wasn't working for me, so what I did was I went to the website. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste this in the command line. If I click that button right there, it would actually install, because this is just an RPM. If I click that button, it would download the RPM, then automatically kick in the RPM Red Hat Package Manager software to do the installation. But I want to show you on the command line. By clicking that, again, it would download the software, then attempt to open it with RPM. Just like if you downloaded a Word document, it would prompt you to open it with Word. If you download an RPM package, it will automatically open with RPM. But for the purpose of this class, I'm going to do it on the command line. So I copied the whole line. I'm going to paste it here. And so this is kind of unusual. I'm not supplying a package name. I'm pointing, using yum, pointing directly to an RPM that's out on the internet. Instead of that RPM being on the local file system, it's on a network file system. I'm using the HTTP protocol as a file system. I'm going to hit yes to install this software. So now it's going to install all these repos. If I do a yum repo list all, it will show me, after it retrieves the packages for the first time, all the repos. Right now, these are the only repos that are enabled. So basically, when I do a yum install or a yum list, it's only going to query those 3 repos. I have additional repos that I can enable, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But I'm going to first do yum list and show you all of the software that we now have available to us. So basically, these pieces of software are from my local repo. These are from the repo out on the internet. And I can install software that normally I wouldn't have access to. Like Xemacs. That's not included in the Red Hat repository. So if I wanted Xemacs, which is like an email client, a web browser, um, a text editor, all built into one. It's kind of old software. Or XFCE, instead of using the GNOME desktop, I could use this one. It's a lightweight desktop. So if you don't want to use a lot of resource for your desktop because your machine isn't very robust or it's old or something, you might want to use a different desktop manager. Right now we're using GNOME 3, I believe, and this is a lightweight uh, desktop managing software. So now the book has you do a yum config manager to enable a repo. I just added a repo using yum by grabbing the RPM and installing that RPM, and that RPM installed the additional repo files. I'm going to show you where those repo files are now. I'm going to do a list, etc yum.repo, and there's all my repo files. So right now we're using this EPEL repo and the local repo. And if we had a subscription, we would be using the Red Hat repo. So I'm going to cat etc yum.repo epel.repo. And I can see that it's enabled for this repo, but this one is not enabled. So if I wanted to, I could come in here, edit this file, and hit 1 to enable that, or change that to a 1, and that would enable that repo. So if I do yum repo list all, that would be the EPL debug info repo. So that would enable this repo right here. Right now it's disabled. See this GPG check equals 1? So that's forcing it to verify that that package has been signed. And there's the key, the public key that we need to verify that for that particular repository. Here's another key. And again, for this repository, they want you to check for the GPT key. So that's how you would permanently enable or disable a repo by saying enable equal 1 or enable equal 0. If you wanted to temporarily, just for, if you're just installing the software and you want to say don't use a particular repo, you could just do the yum install, and then in that command you would say, let me just put it here, yum install httpd, and I could do something like and so by doing it there, it temporarily doesn't use the EPEL repository to install this software. That's kind of a temporary solution. Or if a software is disabled, if a repo is disabled already, you can say enable. So when I install, it's going to try to look in that repository as well. Even though it's disabled, this will temporarily enable it. Now, guys, when you have multiple repositories, like you have the EPEL and you have the Red Hat repository and the local repository. So each one of them might have the same piece of software. So let's say all three repositories will have the web server software. It's going to try to install the software from the latest version. So whichever repository has the latest version, that's the one it will install. So you need to be careful with third-party repositories. EPEL a lot of times will not have a conflicting software that the Red Hat repository has. But if you go to RPM Fusion or one of those, they might have identical software and their version numbers might be different and it might screw something up. So you need to be very careful with multiple repositories that offer the same package. Keep in mind that if you're dealing with that scenario, it's always going to install it's always going to install from the repository with the latest package. Okay, guys, and one more thing that I wanted to do is I want to talk about modules. So we've dealt with groups, and a group is going to group software that a certain person might need to do his job, like the development software, development tools group would have all the different development environments that a developer would need. Then they have something called modules. A module is basically yum module list. And this is going to show me a list of all my modules. So it's a little different mentality in the sense that it's going to group all the stuff for a particular software package. When you have a software package, like I'm going to use the example of Perl, Perl's going to have a lot of different modules to do a bunch of different things. So you're going to define which version, what Perl you want, and what modules you want for Perl. Unlike groups, where groups were related software, but Perl would be like modules that you would add. It would be a module would be something where Perl, it's an additional function you're adding to Perl. Like let's say you want to use Perl on a website. You would add a module to Perl so you can use it within a website, using it in your web server. So a module is different than a group. Group is related software where modules is you're adding modules for a particular piece of software, adding more functionality to that software. Now, we have something called streams and profiles. Do you see how I have Perl 5.24 and Perl 5.26? Basically, 5.24 is one version and 5.26 is another. As they develop Perl, they might change the syntax of a command. So let's say you're used to running Perl with a certain switch, they might have changed that switch between version numbers. But if you wrote your Perl script to work against 5.24 version of Perl, when you run it in 5.26, it might not run. So you might want to stick with an older version of that Perl because that's what your script is designed to run against. Right here it says what is the default. So if I do yum module install Perl, it's going to install 5.26 because that's the default. And you can change that so it doesn't install that version. You can change it so you install that. That's called a stream. Think of a stream as the version of the software. And think of the profile as the modules that are included with that particular stream. So they might choose to install these 5 modules versus these 5 modules because they're the most common. So that's a profile, what modules are part of that package, and the stream is the version. So if I do a list, that shows me all my modules. If I do a yum module info, and then I specify the module name, it will show me, here's my 5.26 stream, which is the version, and the profile includes all these modules that add functionality to Perl. And here's the 5.24. So they're different streams or different version numbers. And I'm not going to bother installing this, but you can read the rest of the book for that. I'm not a developer, so I don't really deal with modules quite a bit. But I just want to introduce you to the topic so you have an idea of what modules are and how to install them using Yum. Again, all that stuff is in the textbook, so if you want to read that, that's in chapter 14. Okay, so guys, that's it for this lab. Sorry I uploaded this earlier and went back and checked it a little bit ago and found out that something got corrupted in the file and YouTube couldn't display it. So I had to redo the whole lab. Sorry for the delay, but I will see you in the next video. Thank you.